From the National Catholic Register, this is Register Radio, bringing light and clarity to the news and topics that affect your life.
Habemus Papam, with remarkable fanfare, a great deal of excitement, and, shall we say, international surprise. The Church was introduced to her 267th Pope, Robert Francis Cardinal Prevost, an American, as Pope Leo XIV. This week on Register Radio, we talk about our new Holy Father. We're going to be joined by Frank Rocca, who is Senior Vatican Analyst for EWTN News, and Hannah Brockhaus, Senior Vatican Correspondent for the Catholic News Agency, who is also a frequent contributor to the National Catholic Register. Hello, I'm Matthew Bunson, Vice President and Editorial Director for EWTN News. Thank you so much for joining me in this week of remarkable news and a major surprise for the Church. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you.
So obviously, we had the funeral of Pope Francis just a few weeks ago and entered into the sede vacante. And then we had, of course, the cardinals arrive from around the world. We had the conclave that resulted in the election, as I said, of Robert Francis Cardinal Prevost, who is the prefect, or was the prefect for the Dicastery of Bishops, as Pope Leo XIV. Let's start with you, Frank. Your initial reaction to what many consider to be a genuinely shocking election.
Well, I have to say, and by the way, I have to ask you because you would know about how they speak in Chicago, but so it's Prevost, not Prevost.
I will leave it up to the cardinal to decide how he wants to, now the Holy Father, but...
well, now it doesn't matter because it's either Leo or Leo. But,
he will always be Leo XIV now.
Right. Where was I? So yeah, well, when like many people... when it was, we don't know yet if it was the fourth or fifth ballot, but we know it was the second day. It was probably the fourth. In any case, it was the second day of voting, so early, in accordance with last few conclaves. But the conventional wisdom to which I mindlessly subscribed was that probably meant Cardinal Parolin, and this is totally. And I was in a room full of journalists, and this has nothing to do with Cardinal Parolin's virtues or qualifications, but from a purely self-interested media standpoint, that promised to be, at least for all we could tell, a rather boring media story. You know, restrained Italian diplomat takes over the papacy. So I was kind of, oh, well, let's what take are we going to have on this and so forth. And then when the news came through, we were just shocked and I have to admit jubilant because the room was mostly Americans or anyway English speakers, and we just thought this is going to be a huge story of never-ending interest.
Yeah, from a journalist standpoint, This was a whopper.
Yeah, I agree about having an American-born or U.S.-born Pope, and even just getting to hear him already speak in his native language in English was something I never expected to hear.
Yeah. So where were you, Hannah, when the white smoke came?
When the white smoke came up, I was on the edge of St. Peter's Square. And so I both had a pretty good view of the people in the square who started erupted into cheers and started yelling, but also the lines of people who were still waiting to come into the square, because I think, I don't know how you guys felt, but I was thinking, it'll be a little bit closer to 7, maybe before 7 that we'll see smoke, but a little bit closer. Instead, it was right after 6. So then there were a bunch of people in line to get through security who just start pushing forward and start running forward and trying to get into the square. And of course, a lot of them were stopped by security and whatnot. But from there, I ran up to the colonnade on top to wait for him to come out on the balcony.
That was a perfect bird's eye view then. So this is for both of you. Let's start with the most obvious aspect here, the significance, unprecedented significance, of the first Pope from the United States.
Yeah, well, it had always been said that as long as the U.S. was a superpower, that wouldn't happen because the cardinals, and this group of cardinals was the most geographically diverse in history, with a much larger proportion from Asia and from Africa, it's a much smaller proportion from Europe and the United States than ever. Those cardinals would say, we don't want to give the U.S. such a leading role. It has been said, and I think it's plausible, that it helps that Cardinal Prevost Prevost. Yeah, Cardinal Prevost. I'll say that until I'm corrected. It was spent so much time in Latin America. He's, I believe, a Peruvian citizen, a dual citizen, speaks Spanish fluently. He seems to have a Spanish family background on his mother's side. So he wasn't, sort of stereotypical Yankee. But still, it's astonishing. I don't know what it reflects, his personal qualities above all, I am sure, but also maybe a sense that the U.S. is more multicultural and more diverse than previous generations had thought.
Yeah, I actually find it interesting, all the fuss that's being made about him being American, because I remember when Pope Francis brought him to the Vatican in 2023, 2 years ago, that a lot was made about him not being very American despite being U.S. born. And I remember feeling everyone kind of making like, oh no, but he's more South American, and making much more of a deal about his time in Peru. So it's interesting now, of course, that we're celebrating the fact that he's the first North American Pope.
Yeah, and the fact that he served in Peru for so long. Let's talk a little bit about those bridges then that he may have been building. He served in Peru. He's from the United States, so he has that connection. He was also head of the Augustinians for 10 years, so that meant a great deal of international travel. That meant service here in Rome. He has a doctorate in canon law from the Angelicum. He then, of course, was also a bishop back in Peru, came here then as prefect for the dicastery of bishops. So he has this extensive international experience. How crucial was that then also playing in his election? And was there a perception then that he's perhaps the most un-American of all possible American cardinals?
Yeah, that's right. Well, Francis favored him, obviously, by appointing him to head the dicastery for bishops. He also did something which, under the radar for most people, he made him a cardinal bishop, the highest rank of bishop, which was a signal, I think, of favor. And, so many people who were in favor with Pope Francis then fell out of favor, but Cardinal Prevost was there for the last 2 years, and so that didn't happen before the end of the papacy. So he was still, so looking back, maybe that was an element as well.
So, Hannah, as we look now ahead, what were your impressions when he came out in the loggia, especially of his Urbi et Orbi and his introduction to the church? And in some ways, how did that, you covered for almost a decade, I think, the pontificate of Pope Francis. What were some of the similarities that you spotted immediately? What are some of the differences?
Yeah, that's right. Well, the immediately noticeable one was obviously how he was dressed, that he had gone back to the tradition that preceded Pope Francis in what he wore. The second would be definitely there was in his speech some of the vocabulary was very familiar from things that Francis speaks about. So there were definitely some key words there, such as dialogue, bridge building, being open to all. I know he made reference to the braccio of St. Peter's being open to everyone. But he was also visibly emotional. That was quite moving to see and to hear in his voice as he gave the blessing. And he also, I definitely put his own spin on everything by not only speaking in the Italian that you would expect, but by addressing in Spanish the people of his former diocese in Peru. So that was, I feel like, him putting his own mark on the his first appearance to the world.
Frank?
Well, a very personal impression. I have to say, for me, this is the first Pope I've known who I knew before. In other words, Benedict XVI, I met him. I had the privilege of meeting him a few times, and he was Pope. Francis came from far away, as he said himself, the ends of the earth.
And hated coming to Rome.
Pardon me?
And hated coming to Rome as a cardinal.
Right. So I never met him when he was a cardinal. So I met him again as a Pope. But this time, I don't claim to have known Leo well, but I did meet him on some occasions. And what strikes me, one thing that's very superficial, but I think it's significant, is when I met him, first when he was the prior general of the Augustinians, he was wearing the Augustinians cassock, with the habit, sorry. And then the next time when he came back as a cardinal, I remember meeting him at a party in the garden of the U.S. Embassy to the Holy See, and he was wearing a black suit rather ill-fitting, I have to say. And so the impression was unprepossessing. I mean, it has nothing to do with his personal qualities, of course,
Right.
and now to see him come out with all that papal regalia, it transforms you, and you realize how powerful that is. Because you suddenly, he seemed to be bigger. I mean, well, I guess he was, because he's got all this stuff laid on him. But I mean, it really transformed. This man has been, now he has a new name, of course, and these things are also part of it. But I just was struck by that. I thought, wow, because if you had told me the day before, what will it be like if he steps on the loggia, I'd say, well, okay. I mean, he may be a good or even great man, but no. But the sensory effect is very interesting.
So to that, his sort of recourse to the symbolism of the papacy. So we saw the mozzetta, we saw the traditional stole. How significant is that in setting a tone for a pontificate? Certainly Francis eschewed all of it to set a tone. And then I want to jump ahead a little bit in our conversation. I want to come back to this. The Mass that was celebrated on Friday in the Sistine Chapel with the cardinals, similarly, very solemn, trying to make a liturgical point in the same way that he had made sort of a sartorial point. Do you ascribe any deep significance to that, or is this some sort of a clue as to what might be coming, Hannah?
I think it is meaningful. I don't want to dismiss it as not, but I think whoever followed Francis had a very difficult decision ahead of them of whether to follow some of these significant deviations that he made from the tradition. Whereas before, popes just did what they did. They lived in the apostolic palace. They wore this and that. Francis decided not to do that. So then the next pope had to decide if he would go back to the tradition or if he would continue. And at least I read it, I don't know if I'm right, but I at least read it as, yes, he was going to be a pope in continuity with Francis, that he's probably going to continue a lot of what Francis started. I'm thinking especially of the Synod on Synodality and that sort of path that the church is on, but that he also wants to set himself apart as his own man and his own pope.
Yeah, can we say that his next decision in that regard will be whether to stay at the Casa Santa Marta, or can we assume, at least based on the little information we have so far, no announcement has been made quite yet, at least at the time of this recording, that he's likely to move back to the Apostolic Palace. Let's just say once it's made in an appropriate condition to receive him.
Right. I think we're all guessing that he'll stay in the Apostolic Palace. We'll have to see if that's confirmed. I think another open question maybe you had brought up in the past was if he'll change his papal coat of arms, change his coat of arms as his bishop's coat of arms for the papacy, or if he'll keep what he had before, which is also what Francis did.
Frank?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think Francis's deviations had a great impact, but they depended for their impact on being deviations. In other words, the power was because he was doing something very idiosyncratic and particular and distinctive. So to repeat what he was doing, what you could start a new tradition, and that's happened, of course. Popes started wearing white cassocks because there was a Dominican pope and so forth. So I'm sure some of what Francis did will stick. I'm not sure what. I suspect that everybody's going to be very friendly to him for a while, and that will give him a chance to do these things without too much distraction.
Well, you're listening to Register Radio here on EWTN Radio. We're going to take a quick break and continue this conversation on the election, the new pontificate of Pope Leo XIV.
Let's return to Register Radio on EWTN.
And welcome back to Register Radio. I'm Matthew Bunson, continuing my conversation with Frank Rocca, Senior Vatican Analyst for EWTN News, and Hannah Brockhaus, Senior Vatican Correspondent for the Catholic News Agency and a frequent contributor to the National Catholic Register. Well, Hannah, when we took a break, we were talking about Pope Leo XIV and how he might separate himself, at least visually, from Pope Francis. But let's get into, I think, one of the overhanging questions in the early stages of this pontificate, and that is synodality, one of the great projects of Pope Francis. Is it fair to say that really one of the first major decisions in that regard is going to be the reports from these 10 study commissions?
One of many decisions that he'll have to make at the beginning of his pontificate, but that is something we're expecting sort of imminently sometime this summer. And it's a significant step in the next stage of synodality, Pope Francis announced. So what will be in those reports will be very interesting. Of course, a lot of stuff has stopped happening for a few weeks now in the Sede Vacante. So if these groups will need extra time, I don't know. If they'll sort of be scrambling to finish their reports, but it'll be very interesting to see what they say. I imagine things will continue more or less as they were planned out.
Yeah, Frank, what do you think will be some of the other early cues that we have? One that does come to mind is who he will choose to succeed him as prefect for the dicastery of bishops.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a very good question because it will give a signal to the sort of men that he's looking for. I don't have any names that come to mind, frankly. I don't, but I just did want to say something that it's true that Francis, toward the very end of his life, approved a new cycle of synodal activity, and there are these reports coming out that you mentioned. But I don't think any of that will bind Leo, because we remember, for example, the last synod of Benedict's reign, which was the synod on the new evangelization, and then Francis came in and he wrote supposedly the apostolic exhortation based on that, which hardly mentions it. I think there are 2 or 3 footnotes, maybe 5. He just ignored it. And he also finished an encyclical that Benedict had started on faith, and it sank like a trace. It was very clearly not relevant anymore because we were in a new reign. So I think these reports, whatever they recommend, I don't think they're binding. And I think the synod itself, now he was active in the synod as Cardinal Prevost, but I don't take it for granted that he'll continue exactly along the same lines Francis foresaw. We have heard that in the general congregations preceding the conclave, there were complaints about synodality as it was practiced, and that it sort of diluted the role of the bishops. And so I know that there's a demand among some bishops, and that cuts across ideological lines, not necessarily only conservative bishops, for restoring the synod to an episcopal institution, as Paul VI founded it. So it'll be very interesting what he does. I doubt he'll repudiate anything explicitly, but he'll reshape it. And I also have a prediction, and this isn't peculiar to him, but I think that this new pope will ease up on the restrictions on the traditional Latin Mass. But I think that would have probably been the case almost with any pope coming in, but that's my own personal view.
Yeah, Hannah?
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, other big things on his agenda coming up. We have the Jubilee that has actually not really stopped happening. It's just kept going. It just
feels like it, doesn't it?
It does feel like it, but it's funny to still look out onto Via della Conciliazione and see Jubilee groups making their pilgrimages down it and going through the Holy Door during...
Even as we were all waiting and watching for the smoke, the Jubilee pilgrims were still making their way into St. Peter's. There was something deeply consoling about that.
Yeah, it never stopped. So, but with the theme of hope, I think, it fit right in. And with the, large number of pilgrims coming to Rome, I think that's fantastic that will keep going now with our new Pope.
So we've talked a little bit about synodality. We've talked about some of these first decisions. Looking farther afield, we know that governments are intensely interested in whoever is Pope. What do you surmise are some of the reactions around the world to Pope Leo's election, in particular in the United States, but I'm also thinking of Russia, and I'm especially thinking of China?
Oh, well, that's a good question. I think, President Trump was, he congratulated him. He seemed very happy. I think from his point of view, Made in America Pope is just what we want.
We would have expected nothing less from President Trump. Right?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think, no one could have, Pope Francis made it pretty clear he disagreed with President Trump on some things pretty strongly, and I don't think that worried Trump too much, and so I don't think he thinks this one is going to be harsher. Mm-hmm. Yeah, China is a good question. I don't, to be honest with you, I don't know what his views. I have no knowledge that he ever expressed any views about the agreement with China that gives the government a big say in appointing Catholic bishops there. I'm wondering if, as a missionary bishop himself, and who has spoken, and for example, even in his homily today, he spoke about the church as a kind of beleaguered target of animosity. He wasn't specific, but I wonder. I'm just wondering if he might be a little bit more wary of making the deals with Beijing that were made under Francis. But that's just a hunch.
Yeah, Hannah?
I think there might have been also a good signal in his first speech out on the loggia of St. Peter's Basilica. You know, his first words to the world being, "Peace be with you all." It opened a question in my mind if one of his first priorities won't be exactly that peace mission. I'm thinking of Ukraine and Russia, obviously, the Middle East, and many other countries around the world. But that did open up a question mark for me about where he'll go diplomatically in trying to bring about that peace, because that was the main focus, or a major focus, of that first kind of tone-setting speech, that first introduction to all of us.
Now, he celebrated Mass, as is customary, with the members of the College of Cardinals, the cardinal electors who barely 24 hours before had elected him Pope. So this is a Mass that is celebrated in the Sistine Chapel. Frank, you referenced briefly that homily. Let's take a look at that in a bit more detail, because this is the first major statement we have from him theologically and in terms of his vision. What jumped out at you the most?
Well, I don't have the text in front of me, and I can't quote from memory, but it's the passage that I mentioned, and there were a couple of notes. He struck that note a couple times, but that the church is mocked and abused, as was Jesus. So that seemed a kind of countercultural note that we didn't hear much under Francis,
right?
And we did hear under Benedict,
yes.
Who was concerned about the church, especially in the West.
Yeah, he had that line in there about the world looks at the believers. He used that word a couple of times.
Yeah.
As absurd.
Yeah.
And to be pitied.
Yeah.
Perhaps to be tolerated.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I'm sure Francis wouldn't have disagreed with that if pressed, but that's not the note he struck. He tended to be much more conciliatory toward secular culture, and can't we all get along? That was more the sense. So I was struck by that. I did want to note. I remember when Francis was elected, he celebrated the same Mass in the Sistine Chapel with the cardinals the next day. And the line that struck out at me then and remains with me now is he said, "The church is not a compassionate NGO." Mm-hmm. To many listeners might have thought that he was saying, we shouldn't get distracted by focusing on only on social services. We also have to preach the gospel and evangelize. But that was not a note that he struck all the time throughout his pontificate, let's put it that way. Many people thought that he did push social and economic justice above other issues. So all just to say, and perhaps in a roundabout way, that we have to be careful as we watch for these clues, because it will take a while for this to roll out, and we can say that we get a clearer picture of where he's going. But this is a strong sign.
Yeah, Hannah?
Yeah, I'll just add that he first spoke off the cuff in English, and that made a big that made a big impression. Obviously, being able to hear the Pope speak in our native language
without an accent. Let's put it this way. Let's put it more correctly. With an American accent. With an
American accent, as well as just seeing him celebrate. Pope Francis in his last years wasn't able to be the main celebrant at the altar, so
that's a really important point.
That just felt, I guess, very consoling to see the Pope do that again, and to hear him, chanting the Latin parts of the Mass. I guess I wasn't thinking about it until I saw it. What an impact that would make.
The last question, because we're almost out of time here. What do we make of his choice of name, Hannah?
Well, I think it's a very strong name. We've pointed out lion,
yes,
Leone in Italian. The fact that he went back a bit in the pontiffs and didn't go straight to one of his more immediate predecessors, I think was an interesting point as well. I think everyone was sort of asking as a shorthand during the conclave, oh, will there be Pope Francis II or, Pope John Paul III?
Right.
Because those also send very clear signals. So I think, yes, that was a message from him as well. And I'll leave it to you or Frank to discuss more about other Pope Leos in church history and what that means. But for sure, that was an immediate message that he went back in history a little bit further.
Yeah, real brief, Frank.
Well, most of us have been were immediately thought of Leo the XIII, and therefore the beginning of modern Catholic social teaching.
Right.
That's true. I would say that he'll probably give us an explanation as Francis and Benedict both did, of their names, and it might not be exactly what we think, so we'll have to wait and see on Monday.
Yeah, well, I know one thing for sure, that this is going to be an eventful and fascinating pontificate. It's already a pontificate of firsts. And I say this seriously, I'm grateful that both of you are here covering it, and I look forward to your reporting. Well, thank you so much for joining me here on Register Radio this week. Let's continue to pray for Pope Leo XIV as we embark on this new pontificate. Remember, for more news, information, and commentary, please go to ncregister.com. For this week, on behalf of our producer Michael McCall and my co-host Shannon Mullen, who couldn't join us this week, I'm Matthew Bunson. Until next time, please take care and God bless.